Since the beginning of America's entry in the war, Uncle Joe Stalin, is what Churchill and Roosevelt called him, was begging the West and demanding from the West that they establish a second front in France in order to take pressure off the Russians. As the Russians are retreating, the Americans and British actually are afraid that Stalin, like Lenin before him, will do a latter-day Brest-Litovsk treaty and surrender to the Germans. They did not appreciate that Stalin couldn't surrender and keep power, and that these Germans were not Kaiser's Germans. They were not capable of being negotiated with. Instead of landing in France prematurely in 1942 or 1943, the Allies followed British advice to go after the so-called soft underbelly and fight in the Mediterranean. But by the end of 43 and the beginning of 44, American forces were beginning to predominate over the British forces, and the American president and the American generals insisted that in 1944 there will be an invasion of France and the establishment of a so-called real Western Front. Now, General George Patton has been used as the great decoy with the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, and its false intelligence is leaked that he will be landing at the closest point, the Pas-de-Calais, which my map doesn't seem to be the closest point, but it is. That's just my bad map skills. And so Hitler primarily expects the attack to fall right here, and secondarily establishes an Atlantic wall. There's fighting off the coasts in the Battle of the Atlantic in the U-boat war. There's fighting off the coasts of Norway as the Allies send convoy after bloody convoy north of the North Cape to Murmansk and Archangel, Russia. There is fighting in the Mediterranean. But for the moment, in 1942, 43, early 44, Hitler's Atlantic Wall cannot be pierced. The British try doing raids like at Dieppe early on, and they get slaughtered. So, no, we're not going to raid in small scale. If we're going to come into Europe, we got to come in big. Go big or go home. So they're not messing with this. So how can the West directly affect Germany? The answer, strategic bombing. Remember at the beginning of the war that the futurists had all thought that the war would be a very short one involving the massive use of poison gas, mustard gas in particular. Well, that didn't happen, thank God. But the dropping of high explosive, that's another story. The Germans start that with the terror bombing of Warsaw in 1939. In 1940, they do the terror bombing of Rotterdam in Holland. They use bombing as a form of to cause a human stampede on the ground, which would interfere with the enemy's ability to defend. Then they launch the Blitz on London. They bomb the heart out of the city of Coventry and dozens of other cities and towns throughout Britain. The Germans start the use of strategic bombing, and they whine about it today. In modern Germany, there's a lot of complaints about air piracy, which is a Hitlerian term for the strategic bombing of Germany. Well, they sowed the wind, and they will reap the whirlwind. The strategic bombing of civilian targets is part of total war, and we got much better at it than the Germans ever did. For example, the Germans only had one 4-engined bomber. It's a former transport plane called the Condor, the F-200 Condor, which was used for maritime scouting to help the U-boats. It really didn't carry a heavy bomb load, not at all. The Americans and the British, on the other hand, developed real powerful, heavy-lift 4-engine bombers capable of carrying thousands of pounds of bombs. Now, the British, who experimented with this early on, and after Churchill took power, they no longer dropped leaflets, they dropped explosives. They hit German targets in German-controlled Europe, but by day, they got slaughtered. So instead of daylight attacks on precision targets, the British would attack cities. They would do area bombing of cities by night. And they would, instead of coming in a massive squadron swarm, they would come in a stream, bomber after bomber after bomber, separated by enough space so that there wouldn't be mid-air collisions. The Germans put up night fighters and used their version of radar against them. But the British could hit a city-sized target using the technology of the time. So by night, the British began bombing cities with increasing ability and effectiveness. But when the Americans come in, we've got a new kind of bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress. And we've got two things the British don't. First of all, on the Flying Fortress, we have between 10 and 14 heavy machine guns, 50 caliber, shooting a half-inch diameter bullet. The British have lighter machine guns, and they're very few. In fact, many times the British took weapons off their bombers to increase the bomb load. But our bombers are, we believe, able to defend ourselves. So the U.S. Army Air Force, the USAAF, believes that if you have a box formation of B-17s, they can fight their way to the target, drop their bombs, and fight their way out without the need for a long-range fighter escort. And with the second invention, the Norden bomb sight, we can spot our targets and accurately hit a strategic target like a ball bearings plant or a rubber factory or a tractor factory without destroying an entire neighborhood or an entire city. The British say this is foolishness, but we're stubborn. So in 1942, we're going to practice this theory, and we make two really big targets, not in German-controlled France, but inside Germany. Two cities called Schweinfurt and Regensburg. And on these attacks, their targets are ball bearing plants. And ball bearings are necessary for every kind of engine imaginable. Ball bearings prevent engines from burning out. Without ball bearings, you don't have engines for aircraft, tanks, or U-boats. So bomb the ball bearings plants, the American Army Air Force planners say, and we'll stop the German war effort in its tracks. So the Regensburg and Schweinfurt raids are launched. Now bear in mind, there are about 15 crew on each plane. That means that each B-17 that gets shot down is 15 guys dead, wounded, captured. In the Schweinfurt and Regensburg raids, for the first time, the American Army Air Force encountered daylight German fighter protection and daylight German anti-aircraft fire. And we lost over 50% of our planes in each raid. It was a slaughterhouse. Even the American Army Air Force planners had to acknowledge that we weren't ready. That at the very least, what we need is a fighter craft, a fighter plane, small and designed to shoot down other planes, that has enough long range to accompany the fat bombers with their city-destroying bombs all the way to the target and back. Before that happens, we've got to be very careful about where we bomb, because if we try bombing inside of Germany, we're going to lose over 50% casualties. That means it's an unsustainable form of attack. So what is agreed at the Casablanca Conference in North Africa between Churchill and Roosevelt is that a round-the-clock bombing campaign will happen, that Americans will attack by day and British by night, and we will attack similar targets. So the Germans won't get a respite. They'll have area bombing by night, strategic bombing by day, and eventually, once the Americans build up their fighter force with long-range fighters, they'll be able to bomb outside of Germany and inside of Germany 24/7, 365, wherever they need to. Round-the-clock bombing. So we are hitting German targets well behind the German lines. And this is one of the horrible aspects of World War II. In most previous wars, the messages would come from the front. I'm sorry that your husband, your son, your father, your brother was killed, your fiancé, and the women would weep. But in this war, it was just as likely that the message would come from the other direction, that the man at the front would hear that his wife and children, or his mother or his sisters or whoever back home was killed as their building was exploded during a bombing raid. Strategic bombing of civilians is very much a part of World War II. Everyone did it, and we just ended up doing it better than everyone else. And I don't feel guilty about it. Finally, by early June, we are ready for the cross-channel crossing, the thing that Hitler backed off from back in 1940 with Operation Sea Lion. And this is so many times more powerful than Operation Sea Lion. Our plan is not to hit the Pas de Calais, where General Patton is supposed to be. Instead of that, we're not doing that. What we're going to do is go south and land on 5 beaches: Gold, Sword, Juno, Utah, and Omaha. Omaha and Utah. Gold Beach, Sword Beach, Juno Beach, Omaha Beach, Utah Beach. We're going to land on the north shore of the Normandy Peninsula. And the Germans didn't think this was a likely target, because the Normandy Peninsula is filled with these things called hedgerows. Along every road on both sides are these medieval fortifications, these mounds of dirt covered by thorn hedges, so that each farm field becomes its own fortification. The Germans thought that that is such difficult country, it favors the defenders so much that the Americans and the British won't invade there. We also sacrifice a lot of people to create false impressions. Now, so we're going to attack there. We're going to attack on June 5th, 1944. But the weather is bad. The next night, the night of June 5th, 6th, 1944, the weather is still bad, but General Eisenhower has a decision to make. If he decides to hold off, he's going to have to wait a whole month until the moon and the tides are right for an attack. He makes the most important decision of his career before becoming president. And he decides to go even in the face of bad weather. He once said that I was the most important man in the world before I made that decision. After I made that decision, I was one of the least powerful men in the world. Because once the decision is made, the plan goes off like clockwork, and you don't need him for a while. So on the nights of June 5th, 6th, 44, American and British paratroops land behind the coast, take up strategic positions, and the next morning, as the sun rises, the people on shore see the biggest armada of ships then seen in human history. The Army actually had more ships than the Navy, because the Army controlled a lot of the landing craft. There were thousands of them, hundreds of warships, all designed to break through Hitler's Atlantic Wall. Now, on Gold, Sword, Juno Beach, and Utah Beach, there was resistance. But Omaha Beach almost became a failure. Omaha Beach is this flat beach with a cliff behind it called the Pointe du Hoc. And this cliff had machine gun pillboxes and artillery positions throughout it. It was a giant fortification. As the American troops landed on Omaha, they were slaughtered. This is the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan. They were slaughtered in their ships. When they got to the beach, they were slaughtered on the beach. If they got to a position under the cliffs where the Germans couldn't depress their guns, then they were relatively safe, but they had to get off that beach. As long as they were on that beach, they were in a killing zone. Because of the tides and because of the currents on the shore, American troops landed hundreds of feet, hundreds of yards, or even a half a mile to a mile away from where they were supposed to land. So they didn't know where they were. They didn't have maps for the area. Casualties are so heavy at Omaha Beach that Eisenhower's other message is prepared. Eisenhower had 2 messages to give the world. One in the case of successful attack, the other in the case of a failure. He wrote them both out and had them both in the hands of his press officer to give to the media in the event of success or failure. Read them both. I'll try to include them in the materials, because it could have gone both ways. As it was, Omaha Beach sees most of the people in the first wave, second wave, third wave die or are wounded. But finally, we fight our way up through the ramps up the cliff, and we take the cliff fortifications, and we establish beachheads at Normandy. This is the beginning of the Western Front, and we will continue the story next time.